If you're new to the world of filmmaking and cameras, I'm going to show you 7 simple hacks which will help you get off auto mode. So let's jump into it. Hey there, welcome to the video. So all examples in this video are going to be carried out on our Sony a7S III. However, most cameras have these options, and even if you don't see a dial on the top of your camera, you may see these options within the software menu. So I just want to say that before we jump in. So let's get into the first tip that you can try. So the first thing we're going to look at is the exposure dial. You will see this on some cameras, and it's one of those dials that I don't think most people even try using. So let's get into this. Now, the tip here is understanding exposure and the exposure meter. When having the camera in auto mode, you simply have no control over the exposure at all. And this really limits you if you want to create a certain type of mood. Maybe you want something a little darker than normal to create a moody look, or you want to have your shot a lot brighter to create a more cheerful mood, or just correct the footage. I'll do this first example on auto mode and show you how it looks. It looks okay, but I think we can do a lot better. So switch your camera to the P setting on the top dial right here. The P mode stands for Programmed Automatic Settings. Shooting in this mode gives you some control over some of the settings which are usually automatic when in your camera's fully automatic mode. P mode is a great way of starting to learn the more manual settings of a camera without taking too much of a jump into the camera system. So the shutter speed and the aperture is automatic, but now you have control over the exposure by using this little dial here. Turning it to the plus side adds more brightness and exposure, and turning it to the minus section decreases it and decreases the exposure of the camera. This gives you more freedom so you don't feel overwhelmed. You can make the shots brighter or darker, and shutter and aperture is controlled by the camera. So that's the first little tip, and you can also use that for photos as well. So my next tip is to make filming a lot easier every single time you shoot. And I think this tip is often overlooked. So when you get into cameras for the first time, especially learning about the manual settings, there's a lot to learn. I mean, the first time you hear about f-stop, shutter speeds, ISOs, it just goes right over your head. But you can watch a YouTube video or learn about it on a channel like this and find out the settings that you need to dial in. And what you'll often find is you'll need those sort of settings every single time that you want to do a vlog. You might want to change the settings every time you do slow motion footage. So what you can do is use something called memory recall. If your camera has a dial like our Sony a7S III and it has an M1, an M2, an M3, or you have that in your software, you can actually use this to save your camera's settings. So for example, we have M1 as our usual to camera settings that we're using right now, or our vlogging setting. And then on M2 and M3, we have higher frame rates. So we can switch to that in a jiffy, and we're filming in slow motion. Now, if you've got a Sony camera, let me show you how this is done. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is lock in all your settings so you're completely happy. So I've got this in 4K, my movie settings are in 25p, recording settings at 100 megabits per second, and then I just want to make sure that my shutter speed is 1/50, my aperture's set, perfect. So how do we save this as an M1? All we need to do is go to Menu, then on this Sony here, we go down to the red icon here for shooting, we go down to shooting mode, and then we go to camera set memory. And then you're going to have these icons here at the top, and this is of course memory 1, memory 2, memory 3. We've already saved ours in here, but all you essentially would do now is press OK, and then it's going to save it to this slot. So simply do this for 2 and 3. Maybe you want to make 100 frames a second or 200 frames a second in HD. Have a play around and save your settings on the memory dial. Okay, this is along the same lines, but if your camera doesn't have an M1 or M2 or any kind of memory recall, it should still have an FN button. And again, this FN button is often overlooked, but this can be used as a shortcut to settings or ND filters, various things like picture profiles. You can set all those within the FN menu. So I have this set up on the Sony a7S III and a ZV-1, so I can turn things like the ND filter on and off on a Sony ZV-1, or on the a7S III, I can press the FN and we can quickly change the picture profile. We can quickly change the audio. We can quickly change exposure meters and things like that. So again, it's just something that you should set up as soon as you get your camera, so you know when you want to change something that often takes you through a huge menu, you can get to it within a second. Okay, so if you love blurry backgrounds, you're gonna love this tip. This is the A mode, the Aperture Priority tip. We've now got the camera on Aperture Priority mode. Now you may want to try out using this one if your main focus is to have the background nice and blurry, and I know a lot of you are trying to go for that. So what's going to happen in this mode is it's going to lock in your aperture. So as I say, we've set ours to 2.8 and the background should be nice and out of focus. Now it's going to keep this locked and your camera is going to do the rest of the work for changing things like your shutter speed, your exposure and stuff like that. But it is going to lock in the ISO as well. So just a couple of things to keep in mind here. Number one, you are breaking the filmmaking 180-degree rule, so your shutter speed is going to ramp up, which means you won't get that motion blur. But it means your camera is going to act a bit more like a GoPro and an iPhone, and that footage tends to look okay. The next thing is it's going to lock in your ISO, and really for the best shots you want to keep your ISO between about 100 and 400, otherwise you're going to introduce some digital noise in some cases. But let's have a walk around. It looks pretty good, I think. Quite a good way if your camera's got a good autofocus. It's just going to keep your subject in focus, the background's going to be nice and blurry, and it's just a good way of getting you out of that auto mode if you want to start practicing with some of the settings on your camera as a filmmaker. Okay, so you're not bothered about the blurry backgrounds, you want to stick to that 180-degree rule. You've heard about it and you want to stick to it. Well, this will help take you from the automatic settings to a slightly more advanced manual setting where we're going to lock in that shutter rule. So you may have heard of this, it's the 180-degree rule. If you're filming, let's say at 25 frames a second, which is standard here for the UK, you want a shutter speed of 1/50. Twice that of your frame rate, and it makes the footage have kind of a nice soft motion blur. You'll often see GoPro or iPhone footage looking a bit choppy because the shutter speed is set too high. So this mode, if you switch it to S, will allow you to lock in that shutter speed. This is probably a better option over the Aperture Priority if you want that nice natural motion blur within your video. Please note in this example, the camera's exposure will shift quite drastically, but it can be quite a handy tool, and you can also lock in that ISO. If you're filming fast-moving objects that you don't want to be blurry, set the shutter speed much higher. This means if you pause your footage and say a car is flying past, the car will remain nicely in focus, and some people actually want this if you're filming high-speed sporting events. So next, this tip may really help you. I know when you're new to cameras, you want to get all of the little settings correct. And one thing you'll see if you go onto YouTube is people telling you to film in picture profiles like S-Log, HLG, or Cine-like and get that nice flat picture profile. These are great for getting dynamic range, but the problem is they add a lot of extra editing time to the editing process. So what I want you to try today is try filming with the picture profiles turned off or in standard. And I think you'll be shocked at how good it can look straight out of camera, and this will save you a lot of editing time. So let's switch to the standard picture profile now. So now this is with the picture profile turned completely off. What do you think of the colors of this? Now I actually film some of the vlogs or quick videos in this picture profile because it just doesn't take any color grading at all. I might adjust the contrast or the saturation, but I think it looks pretty good. What do you think? So let's take a look at these shots here. This first one is shot in S-Log, and as you can see, it's a pretty flat color profile that requires a lot of work. So here's how it looks after color grading. And I'm sure you'll agree, after the color grading, it looks pretty good. But here's the same shot on standard picture profile with no color grading at all. Looks pretty good, right? So now let's take a look at these other examples of shots taken in S-Log versus standard picture profile or picture profile off. Okay, the next rule is to think about your ISO, or ISO, some people will say. Now, ISO is essentially a digital way of adding light into your image, which can be really, really good. If you're in a really low light situation, you may want to increase your ISO so you can actually see the things within your frame. But essentially, you don't want your ISO to be too high. You don't really want it much above 400 if you can help it, because what will happen, especially on some 1-inch sensor cameras, is that you start to add noise into your shots. And you will see this a lot if you're filming at nighttime, maybe you're filming in a restaurant for the first time. The shot will look okay on the tiny little screen, but when you put it back onto your Mac or PC or watch it on YouTube, you'll see lots of digital noise, and that's the ISO. So whichever of these methods you pick from this video to try out, just ensure you have the ISO between 100 and 400 for some really nice, crispy, clean shots. So they are my top tips to help get you out of automatic mode. And what I like about these is that they slow the process down. So instead of focusing on everything all at once as a brand new filmmaker, you can just focus on aperture, just focus on how blurry you want the background to be, focus on the 180-degree rule, and then work around the other settings. And it's also a good way to see how these things affect your image, because when you first get into filmmaking, you'll be playing around with all of the settings and you won't really know which one of the things you played around with when you first get into it made the shot brighter or darker, because there's multiple ways you can make a shot brighter. You can increase or decrease the aperture, you can increase the ISO, you can change the shutter speed, and all of these things will make your shot brighter or darker. So locking one in actually helps you learn your craft as a filmmaker. So let me know in the comment section below, did this help you? Which ones are you going to try? And did you even know about the memory recalls? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.